There is a moment in every man's life when he stops running, not from exhaustion, not from surrender, but from a terrible realization. He has been fleeing from a landscape that exists only within himself. The walls are not closing in from the outside. They are collapsing inward, brick by brick, thought by thought, memory by memory. This is not a story about madness. This is a story about clarity, about the precise instant when a man turns his gaze inward and discovers not a temple of reason, but ruins, ancient, crumbling, silent ruins. And standing among them, as both architect and witness, is himself. This is the origin story of internal collapse, the moment when consciousness becomes archaeology, and the self becomes both the excavation site and the excavator. We spend our lives constructing identities, beliefs, narratives about who we are and what we stand for. We build towers of certainty, fortresses of conviction, monuments to our own coherence. We tell ourselves we are stable, integrated, whole. But what happens when a man stops building and starts observing? What happens when he becomes still enough to hear the cracks forming in his own foundation? This is not a psychological diagnosis. This is not a call for therapy or medication. This is something more fundamental, more existential. This is about the moment when a human being recognizes that his mind is not a sanctuary but a battlefield, not a garden but a graveyard, not a home but a territory in perpetual siege against itself. Before we descend into these ruins together, I need you to do something. If this resonates with you, leave a comment below. Share your own moment of recognition. Hit that like button if you're ready to explore uncomfortable territories. And subscribe, because we're only beginning to map the landscape of internal collapse. It began, as all collapses do, with a whisper. Not a dramatic event, not a trauma that announced itself with thunder and lightning. Just a whisper. A small, persistent voice that said, "Something is wrong." He was sitting in his usual chair, in his usual room, doing his usual things. The day was ordinary. The weather was ordinary. His thoughts were ordinary. And yet, beneath the ordinariness, something had shifted. Like a tectonic plate moving 1 millimeter to the left, imperceptible to everyone but him. He felt it. A displacement. A subtle wrongness that had no name, no location, no apparent cause. At first he dismissed it. We all do. We are trained to dismiss these whispers, to categorize them as stress, fatigue, hunger. Anything that can be fixed with a pill or a nap or a vacation. But this whisper did not respond to solutions. It grew louder, not in volume, but in persistence. It became a presence, an uninvited guest that took up residence in the background of every thought, every conversation, every moment of supposed peace. He began to notice patterns, the way certain memories surfaced without invitation, the way certain emotions arrived without context, the way his mind would wander to dark corridors he had never consciously explored. He realized, with growing unease, that he was not in control of his internal landscape the way he had always assumed. His thoughts were not his obedient servants. They were wild animals, pacing in cages he had forgotten he built. This was the first crack, the moment when the illusion of mental sovereignty began to fracture. He had always believed he was the master of his own consciousness, the captain of his own cognitive ship. But now, standing at the helm, he realized he did not know how to read the instruments. He did not know where he was going. He did not even know if he was still the captain, or if he had ever been. The crack widened, slowly, silently, inevitably. And he stood there, watching it spread across the ceiling of his certainty, wondering how long the structure had been compromised, wondering if perhaps it had always been this way, and he had simply been too busy building to notice he was constructing on sand. When you discover ruins, you have two choices. You can look away, or you can become an archaeologist. He chose the latter, not out of courage, but out of necessity. The ruins were too loud to ignore now. They demanded investigation. He began excavating, layer by layer, memory by memory, belief by belief. Who taught me to think this way? The answers were disturbing. Most of his beliefs were not his own. They were inherited, absorbed, unconsciously adopted from parents, teachers, culture, trauma, random encounters that left deeper marks than he realized. His personality, which he had always assumed was authentic and original, was actually a collage. A patchwork quilt sewn from fragments of other people's expectations, society's demands, and his own desperate attempts to make sense of chaos. He found contradictions everywhere. He believed in honesty, but lied to himself constantly. He valued compassion, but harbored judgments that would horrify him if spoken aloud. He claimed to seek truth, but had built elaborate defense mechanisms to avoid certain truths that threatened his sense of stability. His mind was not a coherent system. It was a collection of competing factions, each claiming to represent the whole, each at war with the others. This was the archaeology of self, the painstaking, often painful process of digging through layers of conditioning to find something original, something authentic, something that might qualify as a genuine identity. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized there might be nothing solid at the bottom. No essential self waiting to be discovered. No core identity that existed independent of all the layers he was excavating. What if, he wondered, the self is not something you discover, but something you construct? And what if that construction is always provisional, always unstable, always subject to collapse? What if the ruins are not a deviation from normalcy, but the actual structure of human consciousness? What if we're all, always, standing in the wreckage of previous versions of ourselves, pretending to be whole? The questions multiplied, the answers dissolved, and he kept digging, not because he believed he would find something, but because digging was the only honest thing left to do.
Once you recognize that your mind is a territory in collapse, you begin to map it. Not to fix it, not to restore it, but simply to understand its geography. To know where the stable ground ends and the quicksand begins. To identify the fault lines, the load-bearing walls that are barely holding, the structures that are only standing out of habit. He created an internal map. Here in the Western Territory was his professional identity, built on achievements and external validation, perpetually anxious about irrelevance. There, in the Eastern sector, was his relational self, constructed from attachment patterns formed in childhood, oscillating between desperate need and fierce independence. In the North, his intellectual identity, proud and defensive, terrified of appearing stupid or uninformed. In the South, a wasteland he rarely visited, where shame and grief and unprocessed pain accumulated like toxic sediment. The map revealed what he had always suspected but never articulated. He was not one person but many, and they did not coordinate well. They had different goals, different values, different survival strategies. The part that wanted intimacy fought with the part that feared vulnerability. The part that sought meaning clashed with the part that believed everything was meaningless. The part that wanted to be seen battled the part that wanted to disappear. This fragmentation was not pathology, it was structure. The human mind, he realized, is not designed for unity. It is designed for adaptation, for survival in changing environments, for holding contradictory information simultaneously. We are meant to be multiple. The problem is not the multiplicity. The problem is the story we tell ourselves about being singular, coherent, integrated. He thought about cities after earthquakes, how the buildings that survive are not the ones built to be indestructible, but the ones built with flexibility, with joints that allow movement, with an acknowledgement that the ground beneath them is unstable. Rigidity is what kills. The structures that insist on being unchangeable are the first to crumble. Perhaps he thought the goal is not to rebuild himself into something solid and permanent. Perhaps the goal is to learn to inhabit ruins, to build flexible shelters that can be dismantled and reassembled. To accept that collapse is not the exception but the condition. To make peace with the fact that he will spend his entire life standing in the wreckage of previous versions of himself, and that this is not failure but simply what it means to be human.
In the midst of excavation and cartography, he discovered something unexpected. Silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the gaps between thoughts. The space where identity dissolves and something else emerges. He had spent so much time analyzing his thoughts, categorizing his emotions, mapping his internal territories, that he had forgotten to simply be, to exist without commentary, without narrative, without the constant internal monologue that insists on making sense of everything. He realized that much of his suffering came not from the ruins themselves, but from his relationship to the ruins, the stories he told about them, the meanings he imposed on them. What if, he wondered, I stopped narrating myself? What if I allowed the ruins to simply exist without judgment, without interpretation, without the desperate need to turn everything into a coherent story? What happens in the silence between the thought I am broken and the thought I need to fix myself? He began to practice this silence, not through meditation or spiritual practice, but through simple observation. He would notice a thought arising, watch it move through his consciousness, and then observe it dissolving without attaching to it, without building a narrative around it. He discovered that thoughts have lifespans. They emerge, they peak, they fade. The only way they gain power is through repetition, through identification, through the story we tell ourselves about what they mean. In silence, he found something he did not expect: peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of having figured everything out, but the peace of not needing to. The peace of recognizing that he could be fragmented, contradictory, unfinished, and still okay. That the collapse was not something to escape, but something to witness. That his job was not to rebuild, but to observe. This was perhaps the most radical discovery, that he could be the ruins and the observer simultaneously. That consciousness itself was the space in which collapse could occur without catastrophe. That awareness was larger than any individual thought, emotion, or identity structure. That he was not just the territory in collapse, but also the sky under which the collapse was happening. The silence expanded, not as emptiness, but as capacity, as the ability to hold everything without being defined by anything. And in that silence, something like freedom began to emerge. Not freedom from the ruins, but freedom within them. Acceptance is not resignation. This is crucial. He had to learn this distinction the hard way. For a long time, he believed that accepting his internal ruins meant giving up, surrendering to dysfunction, embracing chaos as an excuse for not trying. But that was not acceptance. That was collapse without consciousness. That was drowning while calling it swimming. True acceptance is more radical. It is the recognition that the ruins are not obstacles to overcome, but the actual terrain of existence. It is building not in spite of the ruins, but with them. It is understanding that the cracks in your foundation are not structural flaws to be repaired, but openings for light. He began to experiment with a different kind of architecture, not the rigid structures of his youth, built to project strength and hide vulnerability. Not the fortresses designed to keep everything out, but flexible, temporary, honest structures, buildings that acknowledged their own impermanence, identities that left room for contradiction, beliefs that could be held lightly, examined, and if necessary, abandoned. This was the architecture of acceptance. It required a different set of tools. Instead of hammers and nails, it required curiosity and courage. Instead of blueprints and plans, it required improvisation and presence. Instead of building to last forever, it required building for now, with the understanding that now is all we ever have. He stopped trying to become a finished person. The very concept of a finished person, he realized, was part of the problem. It implied there was an end point, a moment when you would finally have yourself figured out, when the internal work would be complete and you could rest. But there is no such moment. The work is never done because the self is never static. We are always in process, always becoming, always standing in the ruins of who we were yesterday and building toward who we might be tomorrow. This understanding brought something unexpected: joy. Not the joy of achievement or success, but the joy of aliveness. The joy of being present to the full catastrophe of human existence, with all its beauty and terror, all its coherence and chaos. The joy of recognizing that he was not broken, because there was never a whole version to be broken from. There was only this, a conscious being, observing its own internal landscape, making meaning where possible, and accepting mystery where necessary. The ruins became home, not because they were comfortable, but because they were honest. And honesty, he discovered, was the only foundation strong enough to build a life on. So here we are, at the end of this descent into internal collapse. But it is not really an ending, is it? It is more like a checkpoint, a place to pause and look back at the territory we have covered together. We started with a man who discovered his mind was ruins. We end with a man who learned to inhabit those ruins with honesty and grace. The question is, what about you? What are you discovering when you turn your gaze inward? What structures are crumbling in your own internal landscape? What have you been building that was never meant to stand forever? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations. Invitations to become archaeologists of your own consciousness, cartographers of your own collapse, architects of your own acceptance. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share your own ruins. Let us build a community of people who are willing to be honest about the instability of selfhood. And if this resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, because we are all, always, standing in the wreckage together. And that, perhaps, is the only solid ground there is.